Just now?
Yes.
No.
Hey everybody, it's your old pal Tristan here, and today we're going to talk about the Monster Kids.
Oh, you're so cool, Brewster.
Is Frankenstein the name of the monster or the guy who made him?
The guy.
Right.
Don't I need a silver bullet or something?
Oh, be serious, would you?
One thing about living in Santa Carla I never could stomach. All the damn vampires.
This is one of my favorite sort of subgenres that came out of the 1980s. I don't think it's an accepted terminology the way I refer to them, but it's definitely one that I know is loved and embraced by the horror community. A few years ago, there was a documentary that came out asking the question, what is a monster kid? Monster kids are essentially that baby boomer generation that grew up watching Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, all the old classics at the drive-in, revival theaters, and on late-night TV, with horror hosts like Zachary. I would consider myself a monster kid. I am definitely not of the baby boomer generation, but I grew up on the same sorts of movies. I guess you would call me son of the monster kids. Because I was the cool kid going to school on Halloween dressed as Phantom of the Opera growing up. The 1970s and the 1980s are an interesting point in cinema history because it's where you see movie fans, people who are very savvy, that grew up with film criticism and who were actual geeks about these things, now being part of the industry. And the same thing can be said for horror filmmakers in the 1980s. The way you really see this is in this sort of subgenre that evolved of young people or kids battling monsters. But the interesting thing about these films from the 80s, it's kind of the equivalent of what happened with Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. All those sort of meta slasher movies from the 1990s. Is you had people who had grown up on these movies, commenting on them and inserting themselves into stories with these characters. People like Joe Dante, John Landis, Fred Decker, Tom Holland, all of these people, they grew up watching The Wolfman on late-night television. This was their experience, this was their exposure. They were kids when they first met these monsters. And so when it came time for them to enter the industry and make movies, you write about what you know. You share the stories that are familiar to you. So you got a lot of movies about kids that literally come face to face with the universal monsters, whether it's 1 or 2 or 3, or the whole gang. And this extends even to films like An American Werewolf in London. An American Werewolf in London I would consider a quintessential monster kid movie. Even though the main characters aren't kids per se, they're college students, it's still obviously made by someone who was a monster kid. And more importantly, it takes place in a world where the classic horror movies exist as works of fiction. That's kind of the big thing about all of these movies. They exist in worlds where the characters are familiar with the same movies we are.
Did you ever see The Wolfman?
Is that the one with Oliver Reed?
No, the old one.
I don't think so.
You can tell watching them too that they represent a sort of fantasy fulfillment. It's like, I could be the badass. I've watched these movies, I've done all the research, I know what I would do if I met a vampire. So that's how you get something like the Frog Brothers in Lost Boys, who just take charge, commando style, and go to war with the vampires.
We've been aware of some very serious vampire activity in this town for a long time.
Santa Carla's become a haven for the undead.
There's even the lighter side of it. Like, Frankenstein is my favorite Universal monster, and I know that if I ever encountered Frankenstein's creature in the real world, I would look at him and say, I've been waiting to meet you my entire life. The most heartwarming and heartbreaking moments of Monster Squad are the ones that sort of subvert your expectations. Monster Squad, for those of you that don't know, it's a movie from the 80s that's usually described as the Little Rascals meets the Universal Monsters. It's a group of kids battling a whole gang of classic movie-style monsters. But they kind of subvert your expectations because Frankenstein ends up becoming their ally. And it leads to a lot of very touching and poignant moments of these kids interacting with something that they know, this icon from their everyday lives. And it's also about how he is startled to realize what he is in the context of their lives. That the world views him as a monster. This is not something he asked for.
Scary.
And you see the Monster Kid influence in everything. Like, even the slashers. You watch Friday the 13th Part 6, and the way Tom McLaughlin refers to the classic Frankenstein movies, you know, you can tell that was something that he was raised on. The fact that Jason comes back from a lightning bolt, that they refer to Karloff's General Store. It's something that's engraved in these filmmakers' brains, the same way the slashers are engraved in today's filmmakers. Maybe not necessarily the best movie to come out of the 80s, but definitely the best in this sort of Monster Kid context is Tom Holland's Fright Night. Fright Night focuses on a kid, Charlie Brewster, who has a vampire move in next door to him. This suave motherfucker by the name of Jerry Dandridge.
Hello, Charlie.
But the thing about this movie is that all the trappings are there. Not just references to other movies, but the way they update and contextualize everything. Unlike The Lost Boys, where they really brought the vampire into the 1980s, you know, they made them American teenagers, you know, clad in leather with long hair and piercings. Jerry Dandridge is much more in the traditional Dracula mold. He doesn't walk around in a cape, but he has a flowing trench coat. He parts his hands, you know, the simple gestures, the way he moves. You can imagine that Dracula is an immortal character who's lived for hundreds of thousands of years. By the time he got to the 1980s, the way he would have to update his appearance and the way he acts, he would end up being something like a Jerry Dandridge. It's a movie that's funny, it's a movie that's sexy, and Peter Vincent, the sort of late-night horror host character that they recruit to be a vampire hunter, played by the great Roddy McDowall, he is someone who, the first time I saw this movie, he's so insecure and his arc is so endearing. I remember thinking that if this character didn't exist, I would have to write a movie to create him. He's everything I want in a good, quirky, supporting character.
You're Peter Vincent, the great vampire killer. That is a character in a movie.
It's sort of unfortunate that Scream happened, because as much as I love that movie, it did sort of set the mold for how the next generation was going to talk about the movies that inspired them when they grew up. This sort of meta approach that has really, really outstayed its welcome, and now itself kind of become a cliche. I also think it helps that the source material, the things that inspired the people of the 1980s, it was much more poignant. Whereas the movies from the 80s, there is a definite fun factor. Like, we love seeing Freddy Krueger slice people up. We love seeing Jason get set on fire. But Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman, these were about the characters. These were about intimacy. It was always about the loneliness and the sense of belonging. They weren't necessarily always evil characters. They were just broken or lost misfits. And I think that's something that the Monster Kid generation tried to translate in their work, that we're all outsiders, that we're all looking for a place to belong. And for them, the place where they felt like they belonged the most, and the place where I felt like I belonged the most, the reason why these movies even resonated with me, is in the world of these classic monsters. Because they tell you that you're not alone, that we all feel this way. And I guess that's why I wanted to share this, because it's not something I really see brought up. I feel like most of the people that watch the movies from the 1980s don't watch the movies from the 30s and 40s, which is really unfortunate. Or if they did, it's not affecting them in the same way, because they didn't grow up on it. They grew up on the movies from the 80s and then discovered the older stuff later on. But it's something worth talking about, because it's really what set these movies apart from what came before and what has come since. So if you're looking for something interesting to watch this Halloween, maybe revisit the Monster Kids. You'll probably be glad you did. If you like this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time.